that's that allowing that loud annoying piece that they did on Zoom, but it's probably beneficial. Got a couple more. It looks like coming in, so that's good. All right, we'll get started here. Maybe about 1 more minute just to see if there's anyone else going to be coming in, and I'll let some other folks in if they come in just a little bit late as well. If you guys are in a safe location and don't mind showing your camera, that would be beneficial to Nathan because it's easier to read faces as he's talking to people than black screens. Otherwise, obviously, if you're not comfortable with it, then you can leave it off. But I'm sure Nathan would like some feedback at some point through this conversation, I'm sure. I muted you, Michael, just so the background noise didn't get to us. All right, well, we're going to get started. And I believe there's a giveaway for each one of you guys, or one of the group here is going to get something from this. I believe we're giving out some really fancy pillows, memory foam type pillows. But if you'll send me a message, I believe it'll be a private message to myself. We'll get your information and make a drawing and see who wins it. And we'll get it delivered this next week here locally in Chattanooga. If you're not here locally, you're welcome to send me your information. And if there's a way I can get it to you, I will. But local is the most desirable in that environment. So, and I'll say that at the end of the meeting as well, just so that we can collect everybody's info as we have more people show up. So Nathan has graciously joined us tonight to talk about the aspects of grief, and especially in childhood and that type of environment. So we're looking forward for Nathan to kind of giving us a little bit of his background so that there's some context to what he's kind of a subject matter expert on, and then on the grief process, looking forward to it as well. So Nathan, it's all you.
All right, thank you, Joe, so much. Let me go ahead. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here for anyone who may be watching. Let's see. I'm kind of ashamed to millennials. I'm not really good with technology, so you may have to bear with me for just a quick minute. Okay. All right, yeah, so like Joe said, I'm here. Joe and Sandy graciously invited me to come and speak about this topic, which I'm really passionate about, really interested in, which is grief and adolescence and helping our teens make sense of their loss. And, you know, I feel like I've done so many mental health trainings, or been a part of mental health trainings, not really led, but just participated in. And all my mental health trainings, but everyone says, well, what an applicable topic, you know, whether it's anxiety or depression or suicide or grief. And so you guys may have already, this may be a cliche statement, but I just truly believe this is such an applicable topic. And I am so grateful that Joe and Sandy thought about asking me to help to present on this topic. So before we even get talking about grief and adolescence, I did want to talk and give you guys a little bit of information about me. Like Joe said, I am a licensed professional counselor. I work as a mental health service provider in the Chattanooga area. And I graduated in 2016, and my experiences included working in homes, so providing in-home counseling in the North Georgia area, school-based counseling in Hamilton County, and working in a pediatrician's clinic, and then most recently just operating my own practice at the Center for Individual and Family Effectiveness. So what's funny is when I look at my experience, I always think back to when I first graduated. And I was under the impression when I was in school that I had no intention of working with kids or with teenagers. I just simply wanted to work with adults. I thought that kids and teenagers would be way much of a hassle, and their parents even more so. And I had no intention of doing that. But as it happens, whenever you graduate school, you will take the first job that you can get. And so my first job was going to be working in home, and I began working with kids and teenagers and their families, and I absolutely have loved it. And my past years have just really helped for me in working with teenagers and with children. and with adults too, but I really especially enjoy teenagers. Also, I wanted to put in there too that I always let my parents know whenever they hire me to work for their kids that I am not, or work with their kids, that I am not a parent. And I explain this because like I never want to come across as like trying to tell someone this is how you parent your kid. I'm under the firm belief that every parent is an expert of their own child whom they have been blessed to raise. And I simply get to join and work alongside them as a mental health professional, getting to provide like just simple tips, suggestions along the way. I truly believe that it takes a village to raise a kid and a teenager. And I'm grateful to be part of the village of those who hire me. I did also put though that I have two cats. And you guys also may hear those two cats in the background at some point because as many of you all know who have worked from home, like our pets get kind of affronted whenever you walk them out of a bedroom. So if you do hear them in the background, I apologize. So let's just get right into talking about grief, about what it is and what it is not. David Kessler is one of my favorite leading experts currently in the field of grief. And he has a saying, which is that grief is a reflection of a lost connection. So as humans, we form connections, whether it be with people, with places, with our jobs, with our cars, with our houses, whatever it may be. As humans, we are connecting in beings. And so grief is a natural reaction to a perceived loss. Whenever I'm doing any type of grief work with my teenagers or with my adults, one of the most common sayings, as I'll say, is that grief, to be human, is to grieve. And oftentimes, whenever we think of grief, we think of as death-related grief, which is definitely, certainly like a part of grief. The loss of a loved one to death is definitely something not to be taken lightly. It's definitely a part of grief. But oftentimes, too, when I'm working with my teenagers, I'm working with my adults, there's oftentimes like a non-death related grief that people experience. So to give you guys an example, I thought about whenever my parents, they moved houses, let's say about 3 years ago, about approximately 3 years ago. And we lived in that house all my childhood. I mean, I spent 18 years in that house and my parents spent about 23, 24 years in that house. But it was time they upgraded, they got a bigger house to just accommodate, to get away from some crazy in-laws, but that's besides the point. But anyway, as they were getting ready to move though, the night before the move, my dad tells a story about how my mom, she walked into each room and she just wept and she cried over each room. When she walked into the dining room, she was remembering where I would have my piano practices. Walking into the living room, she was remembering where as a family we would have our family movie nights, into each bedrooms, our dining room, the kitchen, all of that, just letting herself grieve the loss of this house. And so, like I said, grief can be related to death or non-death related grief. And thinking about the time of coronavirus too, and about what we have experienced, that loss can look like the loss of normalcy, the loss of routine and rituals, the loss of time, being able to spend with friends, the loss of houses, or even to losing loved ones to coronavirus. So this is, like I said, going back, very applicable topic. Grief is also very individualized. David Kessler says that grief is as individualized as a person's fingerprint. So how each of us grieve is going to look differently. How I'm going to grieve is going to look differently than how Joe grieves, than how Sandy grieves, and how my wife grieves. And we also grieve relationships differently. How we might grieve the loss of one parent might look differently than how we might grieve the loss of the other parent. Grief is also unpredictable. You're going to hear me say this soon, but there is no one step, two step, three step to grief. In many ways, one of the most appropriate metaphors when it comes to grief is describing it as being a roller coaster, pulling ups and downs, twists and turns. And grief is also not limited to time. Oftentimes, like, we want to say, like, grief, okay, like they lost the person, like within a year, they should be okay, or 2 years. But oftentimes, the closer the relationship, the harder, the deeper, the most profound the grief. Also, like while I'm talking about this too, I do want to also say, as you can tell, grief is very multifaceted. So there's no way I'm going to be able to cover all the breadth of knowledge there is to talk about grief. But my hope is that you guys get some tips and like some scripts and some ideas when you're working with your loved ones about grief. I also wanted to tell you too, grief is not a disease or a pathology. It's not a problem, and it is not a quick fix. Oftentimes people really want to they want to come into my office and they want to talk about, I just want to get over this grief, or I just want to feel better. I just want to be happy again. It's like they want to turn this magical corner, that where they were before the grief. And oftentimes grief doesn't go away. I had a professor in undergrad, and this has stuck with me my whole career. He lost his sister about a decade or so, or maybe more so ago, to suicide. And he talked about how his grief when she first passed away was so profound. And he said that as time went on, and he allowed himself to grieve, that the grief never went away, but he said it changed how it looked over time. So once again, grief is a part of being human. It is not a disease or pathology, and it's not a quick fix. I'm sure many of you all have heard about the 5 stages of grief. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I believe is her name. She came up with the 5 stages of grief, which is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Her and David Kessler, they went together and they actually came out with a new book recently, which is called Making Meaning, which is talking about the 6th stage of grief, which is meaning making, which I think is really profound. I've not read the book yet. My wife puts a cap on me as my book buying because that is my kryptonite. But as humans, we are meaning-making creatures. And Dr. Kessler and Dr. Kubler-Ross, they're really quick to tell you that the 6 stages of grief are not designed to be like that 1-step, 2-step, 3-step process that I described earlier. But instead, it's more cyclical in nature. So you may have a teenager who feels angry, and then they feel depressed, and then they go back to being angry, and then they deny whatever they're feeling, and then they go back to feeling depressed, and then they could circle around and around until they finally come to acceptance or meaning making. And then, the next day they might jump back to feeling angry again, or they might feel angry again when an anniversary of the loss happens or a holiday happens. These things that provoke these different feelings. So, like I said in the previous slide, grief is very individualized, and these stages are more meant to be shown as these are commonalities that people experience whenever they're going through grief. I will also want to put a quick note, and just as a side note, even though this is not an official stage of grief, I have noticed in my practice, whether it's with my adults or my teenagers, that there's oftentimes anxiety that is interwoven within grief as well. A lot of times people might fear an upcoming loss, like an anticipatory grief, or they might fear the loss of a parent, like a separation anxiety. But oftentimes, like I've also seen anxiety and grief woven together. So going and talking about teenagers, if you guys are on here tonight, I am under no illusion that I need to persuade any of you guys why this is an important topic. But when I was doing my research, I did happen to find this statistic that I thought you guys might be interested in. According to Judy's House, which they've used the child bereavement estimation model collected from the CDC data, they say that 1 in 14 children in the US will experience the death of a parent or a sibling by the age of 18. And because I practiced in Tennessee and because I was curious, I looked at the numbers in Tennessee, and actually in Tennessee, currently that number is 1 in 11. So that is just simply the loss of a parent or a sibling, a death-related loss. That's not taken into many accounts like the transitions that our kids go through, or taking the loss of friends, or the loss of people who extend beyond the nuclear family. So the evidence kind of speaks for itself about the importance of this topic. I saw this quote today. I thought it was really applicable as I was scrolling through Instagram when I should have probably been doing my progress notes. This quote was actually by a local counseling center. It says that kids who are in need of the most love, the kids who are in need of the most love often act in ways which are anti that, which act in ways that don't provoke the most love from us. And so common symptoms that result from our teens whenever they're experiencing grief. Sometimes you will see regressive behaviors. I saw this when I was working with foster care. Many times my foster families would do really good work in establishing like a consistent ritual, routine, predictability. And then the teen would go and they would get to visit with their biological family, and they would come back. And according to the foster family, it was like they had regressed back from square one again. Like you would see sometimes whenever teens are exposed to their grief or whenever they're experiencing grief, they might regress back to behavior that is, you would think might be immature for their age. Difficulty concentrating, you have that sadness, depression, acting out behavior. I'll let you, physical symptoms especially. You think about grief. Grief can often be like a full-bodied response, especially when you think about it being tied to anxiety, like stomach aches, headaches, going over here to lethargy, fatigue. I put on here too grief bursts. I thought that was interesting from a training that I went, but I think that's the best way to describe it. I had a client one time, she was an adult client, but she described her grief as in whenever she would go into the kitchen, trying her best not to think about her loss of a loved one, but it was like she would get hit by a certain smell or she'd hear this certain sound. It was like that grief would hit her all over again, and she's like the breath would just be knocked out of her. So oftentimes you might be seeing your kids or your teens be doing really well. They might be adjusting. All of a sudden it's like they feel sad all over again, or they have like a sudden mood swing, but it comes in like what's known as like a burst. So then thinking back to strategies which are best to avoid. So I thought about before we get down strategies that we could implement, strategies to best avoid whenever we're trying to work with our teenagers. First off, really try to, I wanted to say this, preface this too, like one of the podcasts I listen to says that parenting is the ultimate do-over. And you guys, I tell all my parents I work with, there has been no handbook on how to parent a teen or a kid during the time of a global pandemic, or during the time when social media, you're trying to limit screen time, but screen time is actually conducive to their learning currently. I mean, you guys have had to learn on the fly, and oftentimes there's not, there's been not a script. And I know sometimes I'll be working with my family, and my parents will come in with like these issues, like Nathan, we're trying to limit screen time, but they need to be on screens, and it takes a lot of creativity and a lot of grace for ourselves and our teams when we're working together. So please recognize like parenting is the ultimate do-over, and like that no one gets it perfect. Like I said, I'm not a parent, but I'm a husband, and I have to keep that in my mind too sometimes. I'm like, there's no perfect husband, and I just learn each day. So these are strategies though that I put like from research that I've done and also from my practice, which I think are best to avoid. Trying to fix our teenager. Once again, kind of using, sometimes people will bring counseling or bring their teenager into counseling with like a fix-it mentality. Well, they're just so angry all the time. I just want them to go back to the way they were before. Viewing the teenager as the problem. I struggle with that one, especially because I believe whenever you begin to view your teenager as being the problem, it creates like this power dynamic, and mutual ground and mutual collaboration is lost. Avoiding discussing the loss. Also, I put that one in there too because I'm sure many of you guys have seen these sitcoms or these commercials where a goldfish or a pet may die, or let's say the goldfish, and the parent is so quick to try to replace the goldfish and to pretend like it didn't happen. So, top tip: don't replace the goldfish. Use these times to discuss the loss, and actually, in many ways, teenagers appreciate when you do approach them and you discuss the loss versus like trying to avoid or gloss over. My fourth strategy, believing that there is a right and a wrong way to grieve. I would say if you could replace the words right and a wrong way to grieve, I would encourage you to think about it instead of right and wrong way to grieve, to think of effective or ineffective. And so, yes, my clients have a right to feel angry. My clients have a right to feel depressed. But, I will tell them like, but while you may feel depressed, and that makes sense, does, smoking pot, is that really getting you to where you're wanting to go? Or laying in the bed all day, is that getting you to a life that you want to live? So is that effective or is that ineffective? But oftentimes, whenever we think about right or wrong way, oftentimes our teenagers will begin to internalize, because our teenagers are a little egocentric, and they make meaning about themselves, and they'll begin to view themselves as being the problem, which is, like I said, going up here to strategy number 2. Also, try to avoid providing cliche statements. I think we're all guilty of this at some point or another. Saying things like, well, they're in a better place, or it's all going to get better, or, finding these statements that we just want to gloss over. And then also trying to force them to open up. And so my work with teenagers has taught me, I don't know about parents, but I know as a therapist, my teenagers are not going to open up to me unless they want to open up. So many times I will have a parent come in and they will sit in with their teen during like a family session, or they will sit in and they'll just be like, hey, I just want you to know you can always talk to me. You can always talk to me. I'm here for you. And there's nothing wrong with that sentiment. But usually what happens, it's awkward as all get out. You can hear the crickets chirping in the background. And because the teenager's just looking at them and like, all right, mom, all right, dad, I know. I find that whenever teenagers feel pressured to open up, it's like they want to clam down. They want to go into their shell. Now, this is not always the case, but I noticed whenever I try to like lead the discussion and talking about stress or anxiety or depression, it's like they don't really want to go there. But oftentimes, whenever we might be talking about their music that they're into, or the YouTube videos that they watch, or we might be simply playing a card game, it's like all of a sudden they just began talking. And it really goes back to what, we were taught in school, which was focusing on that relationship, and how whenever you really feed that relationship, they feel that felt sense of safety to be able to open up and to share what they're going through. So going into best strategies for helping our teens. Number 1, I think being able to name it. Oftentimes our teens don't know what it is that they're feeling. I've had adults who don't know what it is that they're going through. They don't know grief. And especially when it comes to these non-death related griefs, like when you begin to actually name it as, I actually think you're grieving the loss of the house that you moved away from, or I think you're actually grieving the loss of that girlfriend who broke your heart. That's another thing too, guys. Like a lot of times we're so quick to be like, oh, it's puppy love, or it's just a high school relationship. But when our teenagers, whenever our teenagers feel it, they truly feel it, and they feel it deeply. Some of my teenagers do. Also, too, like, one of the big differences between adults and between teens whenever they're grieving is that adults, our brains are most of us are fully formed by the time that we're 25 or 26. And our teens are, this is kind of a side note, but I had a teen tell me this was really funny. He was like, I don't know who decided to make adulthood at age 18. I just do not think it needs to be that early. I think it actually needs to be 20s. He was like, I don't think I'm ready to go out into this world. And I was like, man, join the crowd. But adults, oftentimes we have a hard time being able to name our own grief. And especially our teenagers, many times they don't know what it is they're going through. And so that's why it's important as adults, whenever we come across these teens that we love, to actually be able to put a name to it, to say, I think you're grieving that loss. And it's okay that you're angry. It's okay that you're feeling sad. Also, too, guys, be aware of your own grieving process. I'm sure that many guys in here, or many of you all in here, have experienced grief. I mean, you've had to at some point or another. And so being aware of like what losses in your life that you've had to grieve. And also not being afraid to share like your own grieving story. Now, don't try to make sense of it for the teenager. Don't try to like help to like put your own meaning to it. But what I mean by don't being afraid to share is whenever I've been working with teenagers who have grieved. Now, I don't know what anybody's, religious background is on here, but I'll tell my teenager that. I'll be like, I don't know what your spiritual beliefs are or your religious beliefs, but I know something that really helps me get through my dark days, whenever I'm really missing my loved ones or whenever I'm experiencing grief, is I like to think of them as watching over me, or that they can see me whenever I'm going through this life, and that somehow they have the ability to see me. And that's helped me to be able to cope. And I share my teams like that coping strategy, and it's always well received. Um, and then I also might talk about how, like, music helps me cope, which I'll talk about music in a minute. Going back to my third tip, sometimes I think as like, therapists or educators or parents, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves about being able to say the right things or to have the perfect script. And if I had to encourage anyone on here, if you had to, I would encourage you to know that how you listen is much more important than what you say. Sometimes there are no words to be able to accurately encapsulate everything that your teenagers are going through. And sometimes I've done that in my session, that my people, they'll tell me something that they're grieving. And I'm like, I have no words. That I just see how much you're hurting. And I feel that with you. And so actually just being present with them, with their grief, like being willing to sit there and with them is much more important than any perfect script. Encourage creativity. Grieving is a full brain experience. So when I'm talking about neuroscience, and I am by no means a neurologist, but what little I know, and I'm talking to my teams about it, I talk about the differences between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. So your left side of the brain, I tell them, think of L's, like in all the L words. Like your left side of the brain is for logic, language, linear thinking. And your right side of the brain is more like your emotional brain. It's more of your creativity. And so sometimes you might find that your teenagers, that they struggle to be able to put words to what they're feeling. And that is okay. Oftentimes it's not them being, avoidant. It's more about them. It's more about them simply just not being able to put words to it because they're having a hard time accessing their grief using their right side. So when you encourage creativity, you are encouraging them to activate that right side of the brain. And so by encouraging them creativity, you can encourage them, like, what music are you listening to? Or, if they are into art, like what art are they doing, or poetry? But using these things to encourage and cultivate creativity helps to activate the right side of the brain, which, like I said, is you then stimulate the brain, and it becomes helping it to move the grief along. I would say don't be afraid of humor as well. Going back to there are no right or wrong ways to grieve. Sometimes one of the most beautiful ways that you can honor a loved one or a loss is being able to laugh. What our family, we had this cat, and which, loss of a pet is a grief. And we had this cat that we had for maybe 13 years, and she has been passed away now for about 5 or 6 years. But do you know that my parents still sometimes like bring up stories about her, and that they'll find ways of laughing? Or you might be, in a funeral home, and while obviously being appropriate and being sensitive to the situation, sometimes one of the most cathartic situations that I have noticed is being able to laugh at a memory of a loved one. I would also say too, another strategy to use is to use age-appropriate concrete language. I tell all my people that, my teenagers, they have a BS meter a mile long. They can tell when I'm not being authentic with them. And so they have a way of asking you tough questions. And it's okay to be in the moment to be like, I don't have an answer for you right now. But this is going to, please avoid like the cliche statements of, maybe they're in a better place or what have you. But using like concrete language, like if a person died of a heart attack, we know their heart stopped beating. And you might not go into like the whole cardiac arrest or whatever the medical terms with, but using like languages that they can understand instead of like, well, and there, like I said, that some people do pass away in their sleep, so using appropriate instead of like, well, she just went to sleep or she just went away for a bit. Those types of ways, like, especially for your younger kids, they encourage a lot of anxiety because they think, well, could mom just go to sleep and pass away? Or will mom one day go away and never come back? So being very authentic and honest with the teens about their grief is an incredible strategy. And then also maintaining rituals and consistency. There are going to be times, and I'll get into this in our next slide too, but there'll be times where your teens are, they're not going to hit the mark. Like their grades you might see a drop in their grades, you might see them a drop in functioning, and that's okay. But trying to continue to maintain like rituals, consistency, like helping them create like a sense of normality, is a beautiful way of creating that sense of safety and that stability that I mentioned earlier. I also wanted to put in like a little blurb of like when is a good time or when's the best time for you guys if you want to seek extra support. And so oftentimes whenever you guys know your teenagers, like I said, this comes back to the point where you all know your teenagers better than anyone else. And so whenever you begin to see like significant changes in their day-to-day routines, such as them not being able to maintain personal tasks that they used to be able to keep up with, hygiene, if you notice that they're not showering as much as usual, you notice like significant ongoing sadness, risk-taking behaviors, hanging out with people they normally wouldn't hang out with. They don't want to talk about the death. They don't want to acknowledge the death. And for a while after a loss, like sometimes it's uncomfortable to talk about it, and that's normal after a certain point. But when you begin to notice that persistent inability, like to acknowledge the death, and it kind of raises your red flags. That's another area of when to seek extra support. And then also too, part of much of my practice is dedicated to working with suicide prevention. That's something I am so passionate about. And so if you happen to notice, your teen talking about wanting to rejoin their loved one, like there's nothing wrong with like them saying things like they can't wait to see them again. If you happen to notice like it goes into like the fantasy realm of like where it's like this ongoing, and even kind of goes into this desire of a wish to be dead or a wish that life they wouldn't exist anymore so they could rejoin their loved one, is another area where I'm going to seek extra support. And so I've got a resource page here I want to give you guys too. But before I get to that, one of my last things I want to give you guys is the Doogie, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, the Dougie Center, that came up with a Bill of Rights that their teens, they were all in this bereavement group, and the teens, they came up with this list of this Bill of Rights, and I want to be able to read those to you before we get to our resources. So it states, as grieving teens, we have the right to know the truth about the death, the person who died, and the circumstances surrounding the death, to ask questions and have them answered honestly, to be heard and listened to without receiving unsolicited advice, to be silent and not share our thoughts and emotions out loud, to disagree with your perceptions and conclusions, to see the person who died and the place where they died, if we choose to. I want to make a note there, especially like, some teens don't want to go to a funeral home, or they don't want to be able, or sometimes they do, especially the younger kids. I think it takes a matter of discretion. And I would say in that moment, being able to talk with your kids and saying like, okay, this is what a funeral home looks like. These are the people who are going to be there. There's going to be like really using that concrete language if you're kind of going back and forth about whether or not to include a child or a teenager and bringing them to a funeral home. To grieve in our own ways without hurting ourselves or others, to feel all the feelings and to think all the thoughts in our own unique grief, to not have to follow the stages of grief as outlined in a high school health book, and to be angry at death, the person who died, God, ourselves, and others. That's an important one to note too, is like sometimes teenagers be angry at the person who died. Sometimes they'll have like a sense of abandonment. Then to disagree with people who are insensitive, especially those who spout cliches, to have our own beliefs about life and death, to be involved in the decisions about the rituals related to the death, and to have irrational guilt about what we could have done to prevent the death. That is something too to notice whenever it comes to your teenagers, is sometimes they will come with this irrational guilt, or your kids too, like there could have been something they could have done to prevent the death or to prevent the loss. So like, let's say if someone had an argument with a parent the day before the parent passed away, sometimes they come with what's known as like magical thinking. they they had this belief like if they could have done something differently, then their loved one would still have been with them. And sometimes, in those moments when they're sharing that with them, I would encourage you just to acknowledge it and to say, and to explore that more with them, and just acknowledge more instead of trying to argue them out of their guilt. Because what happens is when we try to argue them out of their guilt, it's like they want to hold on tighter. But just simply acknowledge like their pain, and acknowledge like the hurt that they're feeling, and acknowledge the pressure that they're putting on themselves. And say, and truly saying like, I have no words and fix what you're getting, but I know I can see the pain that you're going through, and I know how much it must hurt. Okay, and then let me go back to my slide here. Okay. And then finally, I included just a whole bunch of lists of resources. Like I said, guys, this is a huge topic, and these are primarily where I drew from my research at. And so you have grief.com, which is David Kessler's website that I mentioned before, the Dougie.org, Judy's House, where I got the statistics. Childmind.org is a fantastic, just a general website for you to go to that has just general like mental health tips when you're working with your kids. And then childrengrieve.org, which is probably the leading a leading website out there for children in grief, because I think it's funded by the National Alliance of Grieving Children. Also too, I put my email address down there, and you guys feel free to write that down and email me if you all ever have any questions or about anything that I presented or about the work, or if you all ever need any further resources. I'm glad to be a support. And so thank you guys so much for letting me talk and come and just share a little bit about what I know. And I'm constantly learning in this field. My clients, my best teachers, and I appreciate the ability to be able to talk a little bit in front of you guys. And I don't know, and so I know Joe's got the giveaway, but I wanted to give the opportunity if anyone has any questions. If you guys want, you can pop up into the screen or put it in the chat function. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, I am open to trying to answer them at least, or getting back to you. Yeah, what about teens who won't acknowledge that they are grieving? That's a really good question. That's a really good question, because it's going back to that stage of grief, which is what we mentioned earlier, which is that denial. So sometimes that denial is actually part of the grieving process. And so if they won't acknowledge that they are grieving, and like I said, like depending on the teen, depending on the situation, I believe firmly, like if you try to force them to talk about it, they won't. But once again, kind of coming with a reassurance of like building that relationship with them. And so that kind of comes and looks and see like if you are also grieving that loss too. So if you're grieving the loss of a loved one, maybe still continuing to play the same music that they loved, or using those same rituals, those same routines. And then just beginning to notice like, where your teens are on that scale, if they're in that denial phase. And if they move towards that anger or then depression, like I said, like just kind of acknowledging and recognizing your own grieving strategy, and then recognizing that their denial might just be part of their grieving process then. And then just kind of seeing what you notice as far as like their behavior. If you happen to notice like any decline and they're not functioning really well. And those are the conversations I say, you might not be like, well, you're grieving because Nathan said this and this and this. These are the moments where I say like, I tell my teens like, hey, like I heard that, your grades I think you made like a C this year, or you might have struck, or you actually failed the class. How are you feeling about that? Like just seeing what they notice as far as like their own behaviors, and what they're like. I've noticed that you've been a little bit more angry towards your mom lately. Or I noticed that, whenever we bring up grandma, who may have passed away, that you get really quiet. And so anyway, just kind of noticing like the behaviors and seeing what they notice about, seeing what they have, what they have to say about it. So yeah, that's a really good question, but it's definitely a multifaceted one. Yeah, any additional input about when the grief is a result of death by suicide? That's a really good question. I would say this is also multifaceted. And if you go look onto grief.com, there, David Kessler has like a whole 3-week section on death by suicide. My biggest tips when it comes to death by suicide is not to villainize the person who died by suicide, but to be, especially with your teens, I mean, to be concrete in your language about it, that they took their own life, that they killed themselves. You don't have to go into graphic detail, because I guarantee you your teen is already hurt by suicide at some point. So they're familiar with it, but being honest with them, not villainizing the person who died by suicide. And then also going back to that irrational guilt, just saying like, hey buddy, I don't know if you believe this, I don't know, but I know a lot of teens that whenever they lose someone to suicide, like they sometimes have this belief that they could have done something to prevent it, or they could have said something. And I just want you to know, buddy, like I'm grateful that person had a friend like you or a grandson like you, and there's nothing that you could have done that could have changed it. Once again, like you're not arguing with them, but you're really reinforcing the belief of like that there's nothing that they could have done to have prevented the loss of the suicide, because you do see that when it comes to teens, that they sometimes have that thinking of like, well, adults too, like if only I had seen the signs, or if I'd only had said the things or the perfect thing. That's a really good question. Suicide, like I said, is my passion, but suicide is also very multifaceted, and grief is multifaceted. And so, but yeah, that's a really good question. I would really recommend you looking onto David Kessler's to his website about grieving the loss of a loved one to suicide, and the childmind.org. They have some good articles about how to talk to your children whenever they've lost a loved one to suicide. But thank you for that question.
All right. Well, Nathan, great job tonight. I don't think there's any more questions. If there is, obviously you're welcome to send a message real quickly. But appreciate your time. And there's only a couple people left. If you guys want to send me a private message, I can send. We'll have a drawing for gifts. With only about 3 of you guys left, so you're welcome to send me a private message with your address. And I believe we're giving away a memory foam pillow tonight to one of the lucky parents on the call tonight. That's just something that was donated here locally in Chattanooga. So we're just looking to give back and pay it forward to the next group of folks. So, and if you don't want to, that's okay too. We appreciate you guys coming out, and obviously we do this on a monthly basis. So look forward to seeing everybody again next month as we have a new topic. I think Sandy is still working on that topic. So once we have that, we'll release it out to our mailing list and via social media platform as well.
Thank you for having me on, Joe.
No problem. All right. Looks like we're good to go now, Nathan. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.